The suburbs are often seen as a place of refuge, where families find peace away from the chaos of city life. Neatly trimmed lawns, children riding bikes on quiet streets, neighbors chatting casually over fences. It's the picture-perfect environment for raising a family. But what if, beneath that calm exterior, something dark was brewing? What if the very life that seemed so safe was actually teetering on the edge of destruction? In 2019, in a seemingly perfect Ohio suburb, that facade was shattered. What if, one day, you learned that the people you trusted most were the ones hiding the most dangerous secrets? The events that followed were devastating, and they left an entire community wondering how such horror could unfold in their own backyard. How well do we ever truly know those around us? The story that follows will take you into that dark unraveling, showing how a perfect life can spiral into chaos in the blink of an eye. Meet John, an ordinary man, hard-working, loyal, a man who had built his life around the things that mattered most: his family, his home, and the people closest to him. He wasn't a man of extravagance, but he had built a life that many would envy: a stable job, a loving wife, and a respected place in his community. Sarah, his wife, was outgoing and charming, the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She had been the love of John's life for over 10 years. Together, they created a life that looked perfect from the outside, but cracks were forming beneath the surface, cracks that even John didn't see coming. And then there was Mark, the neighbor. He wasn't just a casual acquaintance, he was a close friend, the kind of neighbor you'd trust with your house keys while you were on vacation. Mark was always around to lend a hand, share a beer, or stop by for dinner. He had become part of John and Sarah's inner circle. But what happens when trust is betrayed by the people you let into your most intimate spaces? These three people seemed to have it all, but what none of them realized was that the relationships they shared would soon lead to unimaginable consequences. How much trust is too much trust? For years, the bond between John, Sarah, and Mark had grown strong. It wasn't just casual, it was familial. The kind of relationship where you don't think twice about inviting someone over for the holidays or letting them in on personal family matters. Their kids played together, their families shared meals, and their weekends were often spent together. It's the kind of friendship where boundaries blur and lines of trust become implicit. John, Sarah, and Mark weren't just neighbors, they were more like extended family. They had a bond that most people would envy. Mark was always there when something needed fixing around the house, or when John wanted a companion to watch the game. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But what happens when those lines of trust are crossed? How do you react when someone you considered family becomes the reason your life falls apart? For John, that question would soon become his reality, but like many others in his position, he never saw it coming until it was too late. Can you imagine letting someone that close into your life, only to find out they've betrayed you in the worst possible way? It started with little things, the kind of things that seem insignificant at first, but, when pieced together, paint a very different picture. Sarah started coming home later than usual, with vague explanations about work meetings or catching up with friends. Her usual warmth began to cool, and her once bright laugh became rare in their home. She seemed distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else during conversations. John, ever the trusting husband, chalked it up to stress. After all, life can get busy. But something didn't feel quite right. Have you ever had that nagging feeling that something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's what John was feeling, an itch in the back of his mind, that something was off, but no concrete evidence to back it up. At first, it was easier to ignore it. Denial can be a powerful thing when you don't want to face the possibility that your marriage might be in trouble. After all, they had been through so much together. Surely, this was just a phase, right? As time went on, the little signs became harder to ignore. Sarah's late nights started happening more frequently, and her phone became a permanent fixture in her hand, always buzzing with notifications. But it wasn't just the frequency that caught John's attention, it was the secrecy. Sarah became guarded about her phone, flipping the screen down when she set it on the table, responding to texts with a sense of urgency that she hadn't had before. Suspicion is a tricky thing. It starts small, but once it takes root, it grows like a weed, tangling your thoughts and emotions. John found himself lying awake at night, wondering. He began to question every little thing, every excuse, every explanation. Was it all in his head? Was he overreacting? Or was there something darker happening behind his back? How many times have we ignored our instincts simply because we don't want to believe what they're telling us? John's mind was at war with itself. He wanted to trust Sarah, but that nagging suspicion wouldn't go away. It was a question that haunted him. What if? And then, one day, John's worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't some grand discovery, no dramatic confrontation at first. It was something much more subtle, much more painful, a single text message left open on Sarah's phone. John hadn't meant to look, but there it was. A message from Mark, his neighbor, his friend. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that crushed everything John had believed about his marriage. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The room grew quiet, his mind numb with disbelief. This was the kind of thing that happened to other people, not him, not Sarah, not Mark, but there it was. Undeniable proof of the affair that had been happening right under his nose. Can you imagine discovering something like that? The person you've built your life with, betraying you with someone you thought you could trust. John didn't confront Sarah right away. He needed time to process what he had found. But in that quiet moment, he knew everything had changed. There was no going back now. The truth had been revealed, and the weight of it was unbearable. When John finally did confront Sarah, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The words didn't come easily at first. How do you ask the person you love why they've betrayed you? How do you even begin to have that conversation? John stood there, holding his emotions in check, demanding answers, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. At first, Sarah denied it. She tried to brush it off, to explain away the text message as nothing more than a misunderstanding, but John wasn't having it. He pressed harder, his voice rising with the anger he'd been trying to hold back. And then, finally, Sarah broke. She admitted it, the affair was real. It had been happening for months. In that moment, John's world crumbled around him. The woman he had loved for years, the person he had shared his life with, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. How do you come back from that? How do you ever trust someone again after they've lied to you so deeply? Mark wasn't just a faceless villain in this story. He was someone John had trusted. He was a neighbor, a friend, someone John had let into his life, into his home. But now, Mark was the reason everything was falling apart. When John confronted him, it wasn't just a conversation between two men. It was a collision of betrayal, guilt, and anger. Mark tried to explain, tried to justify his actions. But what do you say to someone after you've shattered their life? There are no words that could make this right. Every apology only made John's anger grow. Could anything have stopped what was about to happen? Once trust is broken so completely, is there any way to go back? Anger is a dangerous thing. It starts small, a simmer in the pit of your stomach, but once it starts growing, it can consume everything in its path. For John, the betrayal wasn't something he could just walk away from. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the two of them, his wife and his friend, together. Every conversation, every laugh, every moment they'd shared over the years now seemed like a cruel joke. Have you ever felt so betrayed that you couldn't think clearly anymore? That was John now. His anger was boiling, and he wasn't just angry at them. He was angry at himself, at the universe, at everything that had led him to this moment. Something inside him was about to snap. For days, John stewed in his anger, unable to escape the images in his head, the memories of betrayal that haunted his every waking moment. And then, in one single unplanned moment, he snapped. It wasn't calculated or thought out. It was pure, raw emotion taking over. He grabbed a weapon and, without thinking, stormed out of his house. Have you ever acted on impulse and instantly regretted it? In that moment, John wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking about anything except the need to make the pain stop. He was no longer the man he used to be. He was now driven by rage, and the results would be devastating. When John arrived at Mark's house, the weight of everything he had been holding in came crashing down. His thoughts weren't clear, his emotions were boiling over, and there was no room left for reason. He wasn't the man he used to be. He was someone completely consumed by betrayal and rage. The confrontation was inevitable. Imagine walking into a room where the two people who tore your world apart stand before you, unprepared for the wrath you're about to unleash. That's where John found himself facing Sarah and Mark in Mark's living room. The argument began slowly, as arguments often do, but it escalated quickly. Accusations were thrown, denials followed, but John wasn't listening anymore. Have you ever felt so angry that words don't even register anymore? As the tension reached its peak, it was clear that this wasn't going to end with words. John's anger had taken full control, and what happened next would forever change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved. In a split second, everything went dark. John, in the grip of uncontrollable fury, acted out violently. The details of that tragic moment were a blur even to him. In a fit of passion, both Sarah and Mark were killed. It wasn't premeditated, it wasn't calculated. It was a tragic explosion of raw emotion. Have you ever done something in a moment of anger that you instantly regretted? For John, this wasn't just a heated argument. It was the loss of control in the most devastating way possible. His love for Sarah, his friendship with Mark, none of it mattered in that moment. The betrayal had consumed him, and all he saw was red. But the reality of what had just happened quickly began to settle in. The room was silent now, except for John's heavy breathing and the bodies that lay before him. It was over, but the consequences had only just begun. The immediate aftermath of a tragedy like this is surreal. John stood there, staring at what he had done, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his actions. There's a moment after something horrific happens, where time seems to stop. For John, this was that moment. The world had gone quiet, and the weight of what he had done settled heavily on his shoulders. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, had already called the police. The once peaceful suburban night was now filled with the sound of sirens approaching, but John wasn't thinking about escape. There was nowhere to run. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and all he could do now was wait for the inevitable. Can you imagine standing there, knowing that your life is over, but too numb to feel anything? The police arrived quickly, the flashing lights illuminating the street and breaking the eerie calm that had settled over the neighborhood. Officers moved swiftly, securing the scene, but what they found inside Mark's house was something none of them could have prepared for. 2 bodies, a man in shock, and a crime that defied explanation. John didn't resist. There was no point. He had already surrendered mentally, knowing full well that the consequences of his actions were inescapable. The officers, trained to handle all kinds of situations, were nonetheless shaken by the horror of the scene. A domestic dispute had turned deadly, and the quiet streets of this Ohio suburb would never be the same. How do you even begin to make sense of something like this? John was led away in handcuffs, his mind a haze of conflicting emotions, guilt, anger, sadness. It all blended together, leaving him numb to the reality of what was happening around him. As the police escorted him to the squad car, neighbors stood outside their homes, watching in disbelief. This was the same John they had shared dinners with, the same man who had seemed so kind, so normal. How could someone like him do something so unthinkable? As John sat in the back of the police car, everything felt distant. The sirens, the flashing lights, the murmurs of the crowd. It was all a blur. All he could think about was what had happened, and how nothing would ever be the same again. Do you think you'd even be able to process something like this if it were you? Word spread fast. In small neighborhoods like this, news like this doesn't just travel, it explodes. The shock was immediate and profound. Neighbors who had seen John as a gentle, hard-working man couldn't reconcile the person they knew with the person who had committed such a violent act. People began questioning everything they thought they knew about their friends, their community. How many times have you heard someone say, "He didn't seem like the type"? The truth is, we never truly know what's going on inside someone else's mind. The community was left reeling, struggling to understand how something so horrific could happen in a place that had always seemed so safe. Could this have happened anywhere? Is anyone truly immune to the destructive power of betrayal? It didn't take long for the media to latch onto the story, a peaceful suburban neighborhood torn apart by a crime of passion. It was the kind of story that grabbed headlines across the nation. News vans lined the streets, reporters eager for any detail, any soundbite that could make the story even more sensational. John's life, Sarah's betrayal, Mark's involvement, it was all laid bare for the world to see. The media painted different pictures. Was John a monster driven by revenge, or a man pushed to the edge by a betrayal too painful to bear? Was Sarah the villain or the victim? The media's narrative became part of the story itself, shaping public perception and fueling debates about infidelity, violence, and mental health. How would you feel if your most intimate secrets were dissected by strangers for the whole world to see? As the investigation unfolded, more details emerged, each one adding another layer to the tragedy. Police uncovered the extent of the affair between Sarah and Mark, secret texts, late-night meetings, hidden phone calls. The evidence was there, clear as day, and it painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for far longer than John had ever imagined. For investigators, the affair provided a clear motive, but it also raised more questions. How long had John known? Could this have been prevented if he had confronted the situation earlier? The investigation delved into every aspect of their lives, trying to piece together the chain of events that led to this moment. But no amount of evidence could change the fact that two people were dead and a man's life had been ruined in the process. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, family members, everyone wanted to see how the case would unfold. John was charged with 2 counts of murder, and his trial quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in recent memory. The defense team had a tough job ahead of them, trying to argue that John's actions were a crime of passion, driven by the emotional turmoil of betrayal. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a very different picture. They argued that John had time to cool down, time to think, and that his actions were premeditated. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. They said it was a calculated decision. The trial was emotionally charged, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. What do you think? Was this a crime of passion or something more? John's defense team knew they had an uphill battle. Their strategy was to focus on the emotional devastation John had experienced upon discovering the affair. They argued that the betrayal had pushed him to a mental breaking point, where he could no longer think clearly or act rationally. They brought in psychologists to testify that John had been under severe emotional distress, that his mental state had deteriorated rapidly after discovering the affair. The defense painted a picture of a man who had been driven to madness by the people he trusted most. They argued that this was not a premeditated act, but rather the tragic result of intense emotional pain. But could that argument hold up against the evidence? Could the jury be convinced that John's actions, while horrific, were understandable given the circumstances? The prosecution's argument was simple. This was no accident, and it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. They wanted the jury to believe that John had time to cool down, time to think, and still chose to kill. The prosecution meticulously laid out a timeline of events, showing that John had discovered the affair days before the murders. They argued that instead of processing his emotions or seeking help, John had allowed his anger to fester. They pointed to the fact that John had armed himself before confronting Mark and Sarah, painting this as a clear sign of premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion, they said. This was cold, calculated revenge. The prosecution's argument was that John didn't just snap in a moment of emotional pain. He had made the conscious decision to take 2 lives. The prosecution also focused on the brutality of the murders. They brought in forensic evidence, showing the violent nature of the crime scene. The method of the killings suggested rage, but it also showed a level of control. This wasn't a man who lost himself in the heat of the moment, they argued. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and they intended to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case rested on dismantling the defense's argument of emotional distress. They wanted the jury to see John not as a broken man, but as a cold-blooded killer. It was a powerful argument, and it left the courtroom buzzing with tension. How do you convince people to look beyond the emotion and see the logic behind such a violent act? Could they make the jury believe that John had the presence of mind to plan these murders? To fully understand John's mental state at the time of the murders, the court ordered a psychological evaluation. This was a crucial moment in the trial, as the defense hoped to prove that John's emotional breakdown had been so severe that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. Psychologists were brought in to assess John's mental health, both leading up to and following the killings. The evaluation revealed that John had been suffering from intense emotional distress in the weeks leading up to the murders. The betrayal he felt from Sarah's affair had triggered feelings of worthlessness, humiliation, and deep anger. His psychological report showed signs of depression, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress from the sudden collapse of his marriage. But the key question was this: did John's mental state excuse his actions? The defense wanted the jury to see John as a man who had been pushed to the brink, a man who was not in control of his emotions or his decisions when he committed the crime. However, the prosecution countered this by arguing that emotional distress, no matter how severe, does not justify taking two lives. The psychological evaluation became a battleground between the defense and the prosecution. The defense pointed to John's deteriorating mental state as evidence that he couldn't fully comprehend the weight of his actions. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that while John may have been distressed, he still had enough control over his faculties to plan and execute the murders. The jury now had to decide whether John's emotional breakdown was enough to excuse his actions. How far can emotional pain go before it becomes an excuse for violence? After weeks of emotional testimonies, psychological reports, and forensic evidence, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Everyone was waiting to hear whether John would be found guilty of murder or whether the jury would believe his actions were the result of temporary insanity. The jury's decision was clear: guilty. John was convicted of 2 counts of murder, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. It was the culmination of everything that had been debated over the past weeks. Was it the right verdict? For some, the answer was clear: John had killed 2 people, and justice had to be served. For others, the verdict seemed too harsh, especially given the emotional torment John had endured. The sentencing followed soon after. The judge, recognizing the emotional complexity of the case, sentenced John to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a decision that reflected both the severity of the crime and the psychological toll that had led to it. John's life, as he had known it, was over. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, left to contemplate the devastation he had caused. For the families of Sarah and Mark, the verdict was a small measure of closure, but it couldn't bring back the people they had lost. The courtroom was a somber place that day, with no one truly feeling like a winner. How does one find peace in the aftermath of such a tragedy? Could any punishment ever truly balance the scales? In the wake of the trial, the families of both Sarah and Mark were left to pick up the pieces. Sarah's family was devastated, not just by her death, but by the betrayal they felt from John. This was a man they had known for years, someone they had welcomed into their family. How could he do this to the woman he had promised to love and protect? Sarah's parents, in particular, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man who had killed their daughter. Mark's family too was left in shambles. Though Mark had been involved in the affair, his family still grieved deeply for his loss. They had lost a son, a brother, a father, and while they understood the role he had played in the events leading up to the murders, the pain of his death was no less intense. They too were left asking questions that could never be answered. Could they have done something to stop it? Was there something they missed along the way? The emotional fallout from the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Both families were left grappling with their grief, their anger, and their loss. And for John's family, the devastation was just as real. They had lost him too, not through death, but through the life sentence that now awaited him. How do you heal after something like this? Is it even possible? Infidelity isn't just about betrayal, it's about the ripple effects that spread out and touch every corner of your life. For John, discovering Sarah's affair didn't just break his heart, it shattered his entire world. Infidelity strikes at the core of trust, and once that trust is broken, it's hard to see the world the same way. For many people, affairs are seen as a private matter between two people, but the truth is that they often have far-reaching consequences. In John's case, the affair didn't just ruin his marriage, it cost two people their lives. It's a sobering reminder of how something that seems personal can have devastating public consequences. This section would explore how infidelity can spiral into something much darker, especially when emotions like anger, jealousy, and betrayal are involved. How many marriages are on the brink because of secrets like these? How often do people think they're in control of their emotions, only to find out they've been consumed by them? For John, the affair was the spark that ignited an inferno, and the consequences were far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The aftermath of the crime didn't just affect the families involved, it had a profound impact on the entire neighborhood. What was once a peaceful, tight-knit community had been turned upside down by the tragedy. Neighbors who had once shared barbecues and block parties now found themselves avoiding each other, unsure of how to move forward in the shadow of such violence. The house where the murders took place became a grim reminder of what had happened. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories associated with the crime. Others stayed, but the sense of security they had once felt in their community was gone. How do you rebuild a sense of normalcy when something so horrific has happened in your backyard? The neighborhood, once known for its warmth and friendliness, was now a place marked by tragedy. The whispers of what had happened echoed through the streets, and for many, the neighborhood would never feel the same again. Can a community ever truly heal after something like this, or is the memory of violence something that lingers forever? After the trial, John's legal team immediately began working on an appeal. They argued that the court hadn't fully taken into account John's mental state at the time of the murders, and that his emotional breakdown had played a larger role than the jury had acknowledged. They sought to have his sentence reduced or even overturned, arguing that John should have been found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The appeals process dragged on for months, with both sides presenting their arguments to the court. The defense maintained that John's emotional state had impaired his ability to make rational decisions, while the prosecution continued to argue that the murders were premeditated and intentional. In the end, the court upheld the original verdict, leaving John with no further legal recourse. The appeals process was a painful reminder for both families that the tragedy was far from over. Every new court date reopened old wounds, forcing them to relive the horror of the murders. Even though the legal battle had ended, the emotional scars left by the crime would never fully heal. How do you find closure when the legal system continues to dredge up the past? Throughout the trial and the appeals process, public opinion remained deeply divided. On one hand, there were those who sympathized with John, believing that he had been pushed to the brink by Sarah's affair, and that his actions, while tragic, were the result of emotional breakdown rather than premeditation. To them, John was a man who had simply lost control after enduring months of betrayal. Many felt that the life sentence without parole was too harsh for a man who had been emotionally destroyed by the actions of those closest to him. For these supporters, John was a victim of his own heartbreak. On the other side, there were those who saw John as a cold-blooded killer. They pointed to the evidence presented in court, the fact that he had armed himself before going to confront Mark and Sarah, as proof that he knew exactly what he was doing. To them, The murders were not the result of emotional distress, but of calculated revenge. The affair, while painful, did not justify taking 2 lives. Public opinion was sharply divided, and media outlets fueled the debate, each offering their own spin on the case. The media coverage itself became part of the story, with some outlets portraying John as a man driven to the edge by betrayal, while others painted him as a villain who chose violence over reason. It became a national discussion about the limits of emotional pain and whether or not it could ever excuse such a violent act. But the question remained, could any of us say for sure how we'd react in John's position? How far could betrayal push someone before they break? The emotional toll on the surviving families was immense, leaving wounds that may never fully heal. Sarah's family struggled with a complicated mixture of grief and anger. They had lost a daughter, but they were also left with the painful truth that Sarah's actions had played a role in the tragedy. Their grief was compounded by the shame and confusion surrounding her affair with Mark. They couldn't escape the haunting questions. Why had she done it? Could they have seen this coming? Mark's family faced a different kind of grief. Though Mark had been an active participant in the affair, his family had lost a loved one. They were forced to reconcile their love for Mark with the knowledge of his betrayal. The guilt they felt was overwhelming. How could they mourn someone who had been involved in something so destructive? At the same time, they couldn't help but feel the deep pain of his loss. Every family gathering, every holiday, was now overshadowed by the void he left behind. And then there was John's family, who had lost him too. Though he was still alive, his life sentence meant that he was effectively gone from their lives. They were left to grapple with the shame and confusion of his actions, wondering how the man they loved could have been capable of such violence. The psychological impact was deep and far-reaching, with all 3 families trying to navigate a world forever changed by tragedy. Could they ever find peace after something like this? Would they ever truly understand what had led to that terrible night? This story leaves us with more questions than answers. How does love turn to betrayal, and betrayal to violence? What drives a person to the edge, where they feel there's no way out but to destroy everything in their path? This tragedy is a reminder of how fragile human emotions can be, how quickly they can spiral out of control when trust is broken. In the end, we're left to wonder, could this have been prevented? Could anyone have seen the warning signs before it was too late? And perhaps most haunting of all, could any of us find ourselves in John's shoes, faced with a betrayal so deep that it pushes us to the breaking point? As we reflect on the events of this story, it's clear that the consequences of infidelity, anger, and betrayal reach far beyond the people directly involved. They ripple out, affecting families, friends, and entire communities. Let this story serve as a reminder of the importance of communication, honesty, and seeking help when emotions become too overwhelming to handle alone. In stories like this, there are no winners, only tragedy. The loss, the pain, and the questions left behind will continue to haunt the families involved for years to come. But we can learn from this. We can remind ourselves of the dangers of letting anger fester, of letting betrayal push us past the point of reason. And perhaps, by sharing these stories, we can help others avoid the same fate. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let us know your thoughts. What would you have done in John's situation? And make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update on the latest true crime cases we cover.